The first thing people noticed was the cane. Not because it made him weak, because he held it like a gavel. The lobby of the North Bridge Tower smelled like polished marble and money, citrus cleaner, expensive cologne. The faint metallic chill of air conditioning turned too high for comfort. A 40-foot glass wall looked out over downtown traffic, the city sliding past like a film reel. Above it all, a chandelier hung like a frozen explosion. And beneath that chandelier, a black man with silver hair stood perfectly still while two officers tried to make him small. "So," the younger one said, voice sharp as a coin, "you need to move away from the desk." The older officer leaned on his belt, shoulders wide, eyes narrowed. "We've already told you. This is a secure building. You don't belong back here." A woman behind the concierge counter, thin smile, red nails, kept glancing at the security monitor as if it could validate her discomfort. On the screen, his face had been magnified into a suspicious object. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just looked at them the way a person looks at a storm, aware of its power, refusing to panic. "I'm not trying to be difficult," he said, calm as a Sunday hymn. "I'm trying to get upstairs." The younger officer scoffed. "Upstairs? Right." A few steps away, three men in suits had stopped walking, their briefcases hanging at their sides like props. A couple with gym bags pretended to check their phones. Two teenagers on the couch near the coffee bar were already filming, elbows tucked in, eyes bright. Someone's screen showed the man centered in frame. Someone's finger tapped the red dot. "Live." A whisper ran through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. "Is he homeless? Why are the cops here? He's old. Why are they yelling at him?" "He's not yelling," someone else murmured. "They are." The older officer took a step closer. The distance between them shrank to a pressure point. "Let's try this again," the officer said. "Your name?" The man offered it without hesitation. "Dr. Calvin Rains." The younger officer snorted. "Doctor, do you have ID?" the older one demanded. Calvin reached inside his coat slowly, deliberately, the way you move when you understand how easily emotion can be misread. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, opened it, and held it out. The older officer didn't take it. He stared at the wallet like it was a trick. "Put it down," the younger one snapped. "On the counter." Calvin did. The older officer finally snatched the ID, glanced at it, then held it at arm's length as if the letters might bite him. "You expect us to believe that," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. The teenager's phone wobbled slightly as the person filming inhaled. Calvin's gaze didn't drop. His mouth didn't tighten. He simply waited. The older officer turned to the concierge. "You called him in as suspicious." She nodded too fast. He said he had an appointment. But there's no record. And he tried to go past the turnstiles. Calvin's voice stayed gentle. "I asked you to call the office upstairs. I never touched the gate." "You were loitering," she said, words spilling out like she'd been practicing them. You were making people uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable," Calvin repeated softly, tasting the word. "I see." The younger officer stepped in, energized by the audience. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave the building. If you refuse, we can escort you out." A suit near the coffee bar muttered, "Just let the man go upstairs." His colleague hissed, "Don't get involved." A woman in a gray blazer whispered into her phone, eyes locked on Calvin. "It's bad. It's really bad." The livestream comment bubbles multiplied so fast they blurred, people throwing opinions like stones. The red dot pulsed. Calvin looked past the officers to the elevator bank where the stainless steel doors reflected the scene back in warped fragments. He could see himself, an old black man in a dark coat, cane planted, shoulders straight. He could also see the officers, the weight of authority leaning forward. The older officer folded Calvin's ID as if it were paper. "Dr. Calvin Rains," he read, mocking the honorific. "Age 72. Address." Calvin's hand rose slightly. Not to stop him, not to grab. Just an open palm, a quiet request. "Please don't bend that," Calvin said. "It belongs to the government." The older officer laughed. "The government?" Then he raised his voice, letting it bounce off the marble. You hear that? He says he works for the government. The younger one grinned. Sure you do. Calvin's eyes stayed steady. I didn't say I work for it. I said it belongs to it. And what exactly do you do, sir? The older officer asked, tilting his head. You some kind of secret agent. A ripple of nervous laughter came from somewhere in the crowd. Someone cleared their throat. Someone shifted, uneasy, because humiliation is contagious, because witnessing it makes you wonder when it will be your turn. Calvin inhaled. He looked at the phone screens. He looked at the officers. He looked at the concierge who had pressed the panic button like a reflex. And then he said, quietly, I'm going to ask you one last time to call the office upstairs. The older officer leaned in. Or what? Calvin didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat again. Slow, visible, calm. The younger officer tensed, hand hovering near his holster. The crowd collectively held its breath. Calvin pulled out a single card. Matte black, heavy stuck, simple seal in the corner. He placed it on the counter. Then he looked at the older officer and said, because if you don't, Washington will. For a second, the lobby's air felt thinner. And somewhere in the live stream, the comment flood paused, like the internet itself had leaned closer. That morning, Calvin Raines woke up before the sun. He always did. Old habits didn't fade. They settled into the bones. His apartment was modest for someone with his resume. Bookshelves lined with hardcovers, framed photographs that had survived decades without being replaced, a kitchen table scarred by use rather than decorated for show. The kettle whistled at 5:12 a.m. He poured hot water over tea leaves the way his father had taught him. With patience. With respect. He sat at the table and opened a manila folder already waiting there, thick with documents clipped and labeled. A name stayed back at him from the first page. A building. A contract. A complaint. Northbridge Tower. He read without rushing. He made notes in the margins with a pen that had ink like midnight. His handwriting was neat, deliberate. When he underlined something, it felt final. At 6:03, his phone rang. The screen read, Mara. He answered on the second ring. Morning. On the other end, a woman's voice, young but tired, sharp but respectful. Dr. Raines. You up? I'm always up, he said. You don't have to go in person, Morris said. We can send a team. We can. No, Calvin replied. I'm going. A pause. They already denied the initial request for records. Twice. I know. And the building's private security is aggressive, she said carefully, as if the word had teeth. Calvin took a sip of tea. Aggressive isn't new. Mara exhaled. I don't like the idea of you walking in there alone. Calvin looked at the photograph on his table, a younger version of himself in a worn suit, standing outside a courthouse with protest signs in the background. Beside him, a woman with a round face and fierce eyes held his hand like an anchor. His wife, Denise, before cancer took her and left the world quieter. You know what Denise used to say? Calvin murmured. Mara waited. She said, Calvin, when you walk into a room, don't ask for permission to be human. Mara's voice softened. I didn't know her, but I feel like she'd terrify me. Calvin smiled, brief and real. She terrifies most people from beyond the grave. Mara hesitated. You're sure? I'm sure, he said. Besides, the point isn't just the paperwork. What is it, then? Calvin closed the folder gently. The point is that there are places in this country where the truth gets delayed by doors. He stood, slowly, bones reminding him of every year he'd lived. He stretched his back and listened to it crack like old wood. He looked out the window at the city waking up, sirens in the distance, buses sighing at stops, steam rising from street grates like the earth was exhaling. He took out a small wooden box from the top shelf of his closet. Inside, an old metal badge lay wrapped in cloth. Not a police badge, a federal credential, dulled by time but still heavy with consequence. He didn't wear it often. He didn't need to. But today was different. Today was not about ego. It was about a pattern. He slipped his government ID into his wallet. He placed a black card into his coat pocket. Then he picked up his cane. Before he left, he paused by the mirror. Silver hair, neatly trimmed. Brown eyes that had seen doors slam and still kept knocking. a face marked by years, not defeat. He whispered, not to himself but to someone who wasn't there anymore, "I'm still here." Then he walked out. On the bus downtown, no one recognized him. That was the way he preferred it. A teenager in headphones bobbed to music. A mother held a sleeping toddler. A man in a reflective vest dozed with his head against the window. Calvin watched them and thought about how many lives turned without anyone ever seeing the machinery behind their hardship. He thought about the complaint file. A black maintenance supervisor fired after reporting safety violations. An elderly tenant forced out after asking why her building access card stopped working. A whistleblower letter describing security guards trespassing residents in their own lobby. And the contract at the center of it, federal leasing agreements. Federal money, which meant federal oversight. Which meant, if the allegations were true, this wasn't just prejudice. This was fraud with a polished face. At 9:14, Calvin stepped off the bus and looked up at Northbridge Tower. It rose into the sky like a day, glass and steel, reflecting clouds as if it owned them. He adjusted his coat, tightened his grip on the cane, and walked inside. He approached the concierge with a polite nod. "Good morning." She glanced at him, then quickly away, like politeness might be contagious. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Calvin said. "Please call the office of Northbridge Management. Let them know Dr. Calvin Rains is here for the scheduled review." Her fingers paused over the keyboard. "I don't see." "It should be under the Federal Leasing Compliance Audit," Calvin said. Her eyes narrowed. "Are you with the government?" Calvin's smile was faint. "Yes." She looked him up and down again, as if searching his clothes for proof. "Do you have an appointment letter?" "I have credentials," Calvin said. "And what office are you from?" she pressed. Calvin gave her the name. The words landed on the marble like a weight. But instead of moving to assist him, her posture stiffened. "I'll need to call security," she said. Calvin blinked once. "That won't be necessary." "It's policy," she replied, already reaching under the counter. That was when Calvin understood. Not fully. He'd known the pattern existed. He'd studied it. He'd written reports about it. But there's a difference between reading a fire code and feeling heat. He watched her press the button, and he waited, because he'd spent his life learning when to push back and when to let the moment reveal itself. Back in the lobby, the moment had arrived. The older officer still held Calvin's ID. His thumb rubbed over the seal like he was trying to erase it. The younger officer stepped closer, voice rising to feed the spectacle. "You're refusing to comply, sir. Last warning." Calvin's gaze flicked to the teenager filming. On the phone screen, Calvin's face looked impossibly calm. In the reflection behind him, the officers looked larger than life, like characters in a drama they didn't realize they were auditioning for. The older officer held the ID up like a trophy. "This looks fake," he declared, loud enough to perform. "You can buy these online." A murmur surged. "Fake? Is it fake?" "It doesn't look fake." The concierge nodded eagerly. "He's been acting weird since he got here." Calvin's voice stayed level. Acting weird is an interesting way to describe asking for a phone call. The younger officer's jaw clenched. "You're getting smart now." Calvin didn't respond to the insult. He responded to the situation. "I'm going to say this plainly," he said. "I'm here on official business. If you delay that business, you will be obstructing a federal process." The older officer laughed again, but it sounded thinner this time. "Federal process. Listen to this guy." The live stream comments accelerated, now turning into a digital crowd of its own. "Drop his name. That ID looks real. They are treating him like a criminal. Call a lawyer. This is racist as hell." Someone in the physical crowd finally spoke louder. A woman in a navy dress stepped forward, phone held high. "Officer, you can verify his credentials. Why are you doing this in front of everyone?" The older officer turned, eyes flashing. "Step back." "She's allowed to ask," someone else said, emboldened by the camera. A man in a suit lifted his chin. "This is excessive." "Back up," the younger officer barked, scanning the room like it was a threat. The crowd shifted. Not away. Together. That subtle movement, people leaning into witness, changed the air. Calvin felt it. The officers felt it too, and their instincts did what they always did when authorities sensed slipping control. They tightened. The older officer reached for handcuffs. Metal glinted under the chandelier. "Sir," he said, voice hardening, "turn around." A collective gasp. Calvin's hands remained at his sides. "On what charge?" he asked. "Failure to comply," the younger officer snapped. "Suspicion of trespassing. Fraudulent identification. Pick one." Calvin's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened, like a lens focusing. He looked at the cuffs. Then he looked at the older officer. "If you put those on me," Calvin said softly, "you will regret it. Not because I will make you regret it." He paused. "Because the truth will." The older officer sneered. "You think you're special?" Calvin's voice was almost tender. "No." He nodded toward the phones. "But I think this moment is." The younger officer lunged forward, grabbing Calvin's arm. Calvin didn't resist. That was the part that made the crowd flinch. Because when someone doesn't resist, there's no excuse left. The cane clattered as Calvin's balance shifted. He caught himself, steadying his weight, refusing to fall. The older officer moved behind him with the cuffs. And that's when a voice cut through the lobby. "Officer." Everyone turned. A security guard in a crisp uniform hurried from the side corridor, radio pressed to his ear. His face was pale beneath the fluorescent lights. "Hold on," the guard said, breathless. "Hold on. Stop." The older officer snapped. "What?" The guard swallowed. "We just got a call. From Washington." Silence fell so fast it felt like the chandelier had dropped and frozen midair. The guard's radio crackled again. A voice came through, calm, authoritative, amplified by the stillness. "This is Special Counsel Adrienne Klein, Office of Federal Oversight," the voice said. "Put Dr. Calvin Raines on the phone. Now." The older officer's hand froze on the cuff. The younger officer's grip loosened. The concierge's mouth fell open. Calvin turned his head slightly, eyes on the guard. "May I?" The guard thrust the radio forward like it was burning him. Calvin took it gently, brought it to his mouth. "Adrienne," he said, as if answering a friend. On the radio, the voice changed, less formal, edged with urgency. "Calvin, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Calvin said. "They were about to detain me." A pause. Then Adrienne's voice returned, colder now, every syllable a door slamming. "Officer, identify yourself." The older officer blinked. "Who is this?" "This," Adrienne said, "is the legal counsel for the federal office currently auditing your building's compliance with government leasing agreements. You are interfering with a federally authorized review. If you place Dr. Raines in cuffs, you will be arrested for obstruction and civil rights violations. Do you understand me?" The older officer's face drained of color. The younger officer stared as if the marble beneath his feet had shifted. Phones in the crowd lifted higher, catching every twitch, every swallow, every tremor. Calvin held the radio away from his face and looked at the older officer, not with triumph, with something heavier. "Now," Adrienne continued, voice like iron, "I want your supervisor on the line. Immediately. And I want the building management present in the lobby in 5 minutes. If they are not there, federal agents will be." The lobby felt suddenly too small for the power that had entered it. The older officer stammered. We were responding to a call." "Your call log will be reviewed," Adrienne said. "Your body camera footage will be reviewed. And this live stream," her voice sharpened, acknowledging what everyone already knew, "will be preserved. Do not hang up." The crowd erupted into whispers. "No way. Did you hear that? Washington called. Who is he?" Calvin handed the radio back to the guard. Then he bent, slowly, and picked up his cane. When he straightened, the older officer was staring at him like he just learned gravity existed. Calvin looked around the lobby, at the watching faces, at the phones recording, at the chandelier above that had lit so many quiet injustices without blinking. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The reversal wasn't loud. It was undeniable. The next 5 minutes felt like an hour. People didn't leave. They stayed, hungry for resolution, Because in a world where so many stories ended in silence, this one had a pulse. The concierge tried to step away from the desk, but her legs seemed uncertain. Her eyes darted from Calvin to the officers to the crowd as if searching for someone to save her from the consequences of her own choice. The older officer backed up a half step. His hands hovered awkwardly near his belt, unsure what to do now that the script had changed. The younger officer avoided looking at the livestream phones. He stayed at a spot on the marble floor as if he could sink into it. And Calvin stood near the counter, calm as ever, cane in hand, shoulders squared. The elevator doors opened and closed behind him, indifferent. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps. A man in a tailored suit rushed into the lobby, ties slightly crooked, hair slicked back like he tried to fix panic with a comb. Two women followed him carrying folders and a tablet. He looked straight at Calvin like a person spotting a wildfire. "Dr. Rains," the man said, breathless. I'm Daniel Hart, Regional Director. There's been a misunderstanding." Calvin's eyes held him. "Was there?" Hart forced a laugh that didn't land. Yes, our concierge didn't recognize you." And Calvin's voice stayed quiet. "And?" Hart swallowed. "And security protocol." Calvin tilted his head. "Protocol makes people uncomfortable." Hart's smile tightened. Behind Hart, the building's private security chief appeared, broad-shouldered, eyes hard, but now carrying the nervousness of a man who'd just learned the real boss was watching. At the same time, the police supervisor arrived, Sergeant Stripes, heavier build, jaw clenched. His eyes moved quickly. Calvin, the officers, the crowd, the phones. He spoke to the older officer in a low voice. "What the hell happened?" The older officer tried to explain, words tripping over themselves. Calvin watched the supervisor's face change as he listened, the way a person's expression shifts when they realize they've stepped onto a minefield. Then the supervisor's radio buzzed. He answered, listened, and his eyes widened. "Yes, Chief," he said, voice strained. "Yes, understood." He clicked off, then looked at Calvin. "Dr. Rains," he said, swallowing hard, "I apologize. This should not have happened." Calvin didn't nod quickly. He didn't accept too easily. He let the apology hang there, exposed, for everyone to see. Then he said, "It shouldn't happen to anyone." The crowd hummed with that line like it had been struck on a tuning fork. The live stream comments exploded again. He said it shouldn't happen to anyone. That's class. That's power. This is history. A siren sounded outside. Not distant. Close. Through the glass wall, two black SUVs rolled to the curb with a smoothness that screamed intention. Men and women in plain clothes stepped out, scanning, moving with purpose. Federal presence doesn't arrive with flashing lights. It arrives with certainty. One of them entered the lobby. Woman, short hair, badge clipped discreetly to her belt. She walked straight to Calvin as if pulled by gravity. "Dr. Rains," she said, voice respectful. "Agent Torres." Calvin nodded. "Thank you for coming." Torres glanced at the officers. Her eyes didn't flare with anger. They flattened with assessment. "We'll need statements. And we'll need the building security footage. Immediately." Hart protested. "We can provide anything you need, but this is really..." Torres cut him off with a glance. "This is federal." The words didn't sound dramatic. They sounded like a door locking. In the next hour, consequences began to sprout like cracks in glass. The older officer's body language collapsed into something smaller. Torres asked for his name, badge number, and camera footage. His hands trembled as he complied. The concierge was escorted into a side office. Her earlier confidence had dissolved into a shaky silence. The building management team began making phone calls so frantic their voices rose into thin, panicked pitches. Lawyers were summoned like fire extinguishers. Outside, more people gathered, drawn by notifications, by viral urgency, by the scent of a story turning. Calvin watched the scene unfold, the machinery of accountability grinding into motion. Not because he wanted a spectacle, because the spectacle had already happened. And now the country was watching what happened after. By evening, the video was everywhere. A clipped moment of the older officer saying, "You expect us to believe that," set to a caption in bold letters. A shot of Calvin's cane clattering, not from weakness but from being grabbed. A clear audio snippet of the radio voice. "This is Special Counsel Adrienne Klein." And then the silence. Pure, cinematic silence, as the lobby realized the power dynamic had flipped. Millions of views by midnight. Hashtags bloomed. People argued, cried, raged, defended, denied, confessed. But no matter what side they tried to take, one thing was undeniable. It had happened in public. It had happened on camera. It had happened to a calm old man who hadn't done anything wrong. The police department released a statement within hours. An incident is under review. Officers have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Administrative leave, a phrase that tried to soften reality. But the internet didn't soften. News stations picked it up before sunrise. Morning anchors played the clip with furrowed brows. Pundits talked about procedure and perception and protocol, using words that floated above the bruise instead of touching it. Then came the second wave, the federal audit announcement. A press release from a Washington office confirmed that Northbridge Tower was under compliance review regarding federal leasing contracts, safety reporting, and discrimination complaints. That part wasn't flashy. It was deadly, because it meant money. It meant contracts. It meant proof. By noon the next day, Northbridge Holdings stock dipped sharply. Investors don't like uncertainty, and nothing screams uncertainty like federal scrutiny wrapped in viral outrage. Tenants in the building started sharing their own stories in threads. A black woman described being stopped 3 times in 1 week by private security for not having her badge visible, while her white co-workers walked through unbothered. A delivery driver described being forced to use a back entrance for appearance. A veteran described being questioned for sitting in the lobby while waiting for his grandson. The complaint file Calvin had read wasn't a single story. It was a chorus, and now it had a microphone. 3 days later, Daniel Hart resigned for personal reasons. 2 private security guards were terminated after footage showed them mocking residents on a different day. The concierge was suspended and later fired when internal emails surfaced, messages where she described certain visitors as sketchy and probably not legit, with a pattern that was hard to ignore. The police department announced an external review. Not internal, external. That mattered. And quietly, without cameras, Calvin sat in a federal office and watched evidence stack up like bricks. Statements, footage, contracts, emails, patents. A week later, a civil lawsuit was filed by the maintenance supervisor who had first reported safety violations, now represented by attorneys who had called him back after the video made ignoring him impossible. The city council scheduled hearings. Community leaders demanded changes. The police chief appeared on TV with a tight face, promising reform, but his eyes looked like a man who'd realized promises were no longer enough. Every consequence felt realistic, heavy, imperfect. Because accountability isn't a movie ending. It's paperwork and pressure and people losing sleep. It's families affected. It's reputations collapsing. It's a slow, grinding shift that hurts on the way through. Calvin didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He showed up. He testified. He stayed calm. And when reporters finally caught him outside a hearing and shoved microphones toward his face, he paused. The cameras zoomed in, hungry. A reporter asked, "Dr. Rains, do you feel vindicated?" Calvin looked at the crowd gathered behind the barricades. Young faces, old faces, black faces, brown faces, white faces, all of them watching. He answered the way he always answered. With truth. "I feel tired," he said. Laughter flickered, uncertain. Then he continued. "I feel tired because what happened to me is not unique," Calvin said. "The only unique part is that the call came fast." His voice wasn't bitter. It was clear. "And if you're asking me whether I'm glad it was filmed," he said, eyes steady, "I'm glad because the camera did what people are supposed to do." He turned slightly toward the crowd, speaking louder now, not for drama, but for reach. It witnessed. The word hit like a bell. A reporter tried again. "Do you want the officers fired?" Calvin's gaze didn't harden. It softened. And somehow that softness carried more weight than rage. I want them honest, he said. I want them trained. I want them accountable. And I want them to understand that their power is not a personality trait. He paused, letting the air hold his words. Some of you will watch that video and think, I would never do that. Calvin's voice deepened, warm but firm. But the question isn't only what you would do with a badge. He tapped his cane once on the pavement. The sound was small, but everyone listened. The question is what you do with your discomfort, Calvin said. Because discomfort is where bias likes to hide. It dresses up like caution. It pretends to be protocol. It uses the word suspicious like a shield. He looked straight into the nearest camera. And if your first instinct is to doubt a person's dignity, he said, ask yourself why. Not later. Not after the damage. In the moment. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Because dignity isn't something you earn from somebody else's approval, Calvin said. It's something you owe each other the second you share a room. Behind him, someone in the crowd whispered, damn. Calvin finished with a line that traveled farther than he did. Justice isn't revenge, he said. Justice is repay. Then he stepped away from the microphones and walked to his car, cane steady, shoulders straight, leaving the cameras with something they weren't used to. A man who refused to make hatred the center of the story. Months passed. The seasons shifted, as they always did, indifferent to human drama. But the city wasn't entirely the same. By late summer, new policies had been implemented at Northbridge Tower, updated visitor protocols, tenant advocacy liaisons, mandatory bias training for private security, and oversight requirements tied directly to their federal contracts. Not because they suddenly grew hearts. Because accountability had teeth. The police department, under pressure from community groups and the external review, rolled out body camera compliance audits and disciplinary reforms. 2 officers from the lobby incident were formally terminated after the investigation concluded they had violated procedure and escalated without cause. The older officers' termination sparked protests from the union, support from residents, and a televised debate that forced the department to confront itself in public. The younger officer resigned before his hearing, disappearing into private life with a stain that followed him like shadow. The city paid a settlement to the maintenance supervisor, not enough to erase what he'd endured, but enough to acknowledge, in the only language institutions seemed to speak fluently, that harm had been done. And Calvin returned to his quiet routines. Tea at dawn, folders at the table, notes in the margins. But now, when he took the bus, people sometimes recognized him. At first it startled him, hands reaching out, voices calling his name, strangers saying thank you like it was owed. He tried to wave it off. He tried to keep walking. But one afternoon, as he exited a community center where he'd been speaking to young auditors and local advocates, a teenage boy approached him. The boy held a phone like it was fragile. So, the boy said, voice cracking slightly, my grandma, she watched your video. Calvin paused, leaning lightly on his cane. All right. The boy swallowed. She said she's been treated like that her whole life. And when she saw you stand there, calm, she cried. She said she didn't know you could be calm and still be strong. Calvin felt something press against his ribs. Not pride, not sadness, something like recognition. He nodded slowly. Tell your grandma, Calvin said, that calm is not surrender. The boy's eyes shone. Can I take a picture with you? Calvin smiled. Of course. They stood side by side while the phone clicked. In the background, the community center buzzed with voices, people organizing, learning, building. Later that month, Calvin attended a city council meeting where a new civilian oversight panel was introduced. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't everything people wanted. But it was a door that hadn't been opened before. A council member introduced Calvin as a catalyst. Calvin disliked the word. Catalysts implied explosions. And Calvin had never wanted an explosion. He had wanted a mirror. After the meeting, a woman approached him. Middle-aged, tired eyes, pressed blazer. She looked like someone who had carried consequences not of her making. I worked at Northbridge, she said quietly. In HR. Calvin studied her face. She didn't look defensive. She looked haunted. I saw things, she continued. I didn't stop them. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself I'd lose my job. I told myself a lot of things. Calvin didn't interrupt. Her voice shook. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I needed you to know I'm sorry. Calvin let a long breath out through his nose. When he spoke, his voice was soft. I don't know what you should do with your sorry, he said, but I know what you can do with your next chance. Tears spilled from her eyes, sudden and unguarded. Calvin didn't touch her. He'd learned not everyone wants comfort from a stranger. He simply held her gaze. A moment later, she nodded and walked away, shoulders trembling but straighter than before. Redemption, Calvin knew, was not a speech. It was a choice repeated, and downfall was often the same. That fall, the lobby of Northbridge Tower looked different. Not because the marble changed, but because the posture of the people inside it did. A new concierge worked the desk. She greeted visitors with a steady gaze and a practiced kindness that didn't feel like performance. Security guards stood nearby, but their presence felt less like a trap and more like a duty. On the wall near the elevators, a framed notice hung with clear language about visitor rights and complaint reporting. Paper on a wall doesn't solve everything, but it signals something institutions fail. Visibility. Calvin walked into that same lobby one afternoon, not for an audit this time, but for a community meeting with tenants and building leadership. A few heads turned, a few whispers rose, and then the new concierge smiled at him, warm and genuine. Good afternoon, Dr. Rains, she said. Welcome back. Calvin nodded. Good afternoon, he replied. He stepped forward, cane tapping lightly, and the sound echoed through the marble like a reminder. Not of power, of presence. So here's the question that lingers after the live stream ends, after the headlines fade, after the lobby returns to its normal shine. When you see someone being doubted, diminished, or pushed toward the edge in public, when the humiliation is happening right in front of you, will you be the one who looks away, or the one who witnesses, speaks, and helps change what happens next?